Her name was Margaret Wilson. For 35 years she woke up before the sun and slept after everyone else. Not because she wanted to, because 4 lives depended on her. Margaret was not an ordinary woman. She was a senior operations manager in a large corporate firm in Chicago, respected, well-paid, always busy. People admired her confidence. No one asked how tired her heart was. She had 4 children. 2 sons, Daniel and Michael, 2 daughters, Sophia and Emily. And after their father died suddenly, Margaret became both mother and father. She didn't cry long. Bills don't wait for grief. She worked double shifts, came home late, cooked dinner with swollen feet, checked homework with tired eyes, and still smiled, because mothers believe smiling fixes everything. She paid for Daniel's engineering degree, helped Michael start his own business, saved for Sophia's wedding, gave Emily a new house after marriage. Every child had a home, except her. People used to say, "Margaret, you're lucky, your children are settled." She smiled politely. Luck didn't build those lives, she did. Years passed, children got married, partners entered the family, and slowly Margaret's place in her own family began to shrink. Daniel's wife, Laura, didn't like her advice. Michael's partner, Rachel, hated her presence. Sophia's husband said she was old-fashioned. Emily stopped visiting often, not intentionally, just slowly. When Margaret retired at 64, she expected peace. Instead, she felt invisible. Phone calls stopped. Visits became rare. Everyone was busy. One winter morning, Margaret slipped in the bathroom. She lay on the cold floor for nearly 2 hours. Her phone was just out of reach. When she finally managed to call Daniel, he said, "Mom, I'm in a meeting." "Call Michael." Michael didn't answer. She went to the hospital alone. The nurse asked gently, "Is your family coming?" Margaret smiled. "They will," she said. They didn't. Months later, Daniel invited everyone for dinner, all 4 children. All 4 partners. Margaret felt hopeful. She wore her best sweater. The food was barely touched when Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, we need to talk." That sentence carried danger. "We think," Michael added quickly, "it would be better if you moved to a senior care facility." The room went silent. Margaret thought she heard wrong. "What?" she whispered. "You'll be taken care of," Sophia said. "Nurses, doctors, people your age." "People your age, not your children." Margaret looked around the table, at the faces she once fed with her own hands. "Don't any of you have space for me?" she asked. No one answered. Partners avoided eye contact. Children stared at plates. An argument followed. Voices rose. Laura snapped, "She complains too much." Rachel added, "She makes everyone uncomfortable." Michael lost his temper. Sophia cried. A glass shattered, so did something else. Respect. Margaret stood up slowly. "I never asked for luxury," she said quietly. "I only wanted family." No one stopped her. That night she packed a small bag, not clothes, memories. Old photographs, her husband's watch, her retirement papers. At the gate of the Maple Grove senior home, she turned back one last time, hoping, praying someone would say, "Mom, come home." No one did. The door closed. A woman who built 4 successful lives was now room 214. She sat on the bed, stared at the blank walls, and whispered through tears, "Why do children forget when parents grow old?" Outside, her children slept peacefully. Inside, their mother learned what loneliness really means. And this was only the beginning. Room 214 smelled like disinfectant and old perfume. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on, as if keeping it on could keep her connected to the life she had been thrown out of. Outside her window, the parking lot lights flickered like tired eyes. A nurse smiled politely. "Welcome to Maple Grove, Miss Wilson. Dinner is at 6. Margaret nodded like she understood. But inside, her mind kept repeating one sentence. "My children left me here. Not strangers. Not enemies. Her children." That first night, she didn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the dinner table again, Daniel's serious face, Michael's quick agreement, Sophia's nervous tears, Emily's silence. Emily's silence hurt the most. Silence is a choice. And that night, her youngest daughter chose not to fight for her. The next morning, Margaret called Daniel, straight to voicemail. She called Michael. No answer. She called Sophia. It rang. She picked up. "Mom." Sophia's voice sounded guilty, like she had been waiting for this call and dreading it at the same time. Margaret swallowed. "I just wanted to hear your voice." Sophia paused. "Are you okay?" Margaret almost laughed. Was she okay, in a room with strangers, holding her husband's watch like a lifeline? I'm fine, Margaret lied. Tell me something, when are you coming to visit? Sophia's breath tightened. Soon, Mom. We're just figuring things out. Figuring things out. Margaret understood that phrase now. It meant we are figuring out how to live without you. 2 days passed. No visits, no calls. And then the first betrayal arrived, not from her children, but from the people who married into her family. Margaret received a notification on her phone, bank alert, account activity. She stared at the screen, a withdrawal, then another. Large amounts? She opened the app with shaking hands. Someone was moving money, her money, out of the account she had used for years, the account she kept for emergencies. This was an emergency. She called Daniel again. This time he answered. Mom, what is it? He asked, annoyed like she had interrupted something important. Margaret tried to stay calm. Daniel, did you take money from my account? Silence, then a sigh. Laura handled some paperwork, Daniel said. Don't worry, it's just reorganizing. Reorganizing, Margaret repeated, her voice thin. We're managing things now, Daniel replied, as if talking to a child. It's easier, you're in a facility, they take care of you. You don't need to stress about finances. Margaret felt her throat tighten. So you took control of my money after you put me in an old home? Mom, don't make it sound dramatic, Daniel snapped. You're safe there. This is what's best. Then he added something that made Margaret's stomach drop. And please don't call me every day. Laura thinks it's unhealthy. Unhealthy. Her wanting to speak to her own son was now a problem. Daniel ended the call before she could speak again. Margaret stared at the phone, her hands cold. For the first time, she didn't just feel abandoned. She felt used. That afternoon, Emily finally called. Margaret's heart jumped because even pain becomes hopeful when it wears the face of someone you love. Mom, Emily said softly. Margaret closed her eyes. Sweetheart, why didn't you say anything at dinner? Emily's silence lasted too long. Then she whispered, I tried. Margaret waited. Emily's voice lowered. Mark said if you move in with us, it'll destroy our marriage. He said we'll never have privacy. He said you'll control everything. Margaret felt something crack inside. Emily, she said gently, I controlled everything when I was working 2 jobs to feed you. I controlled everything when your father died. I controlled everything because nobody else would. Emily started crying. I know. I'm sorry. Margaret's eyes filled, but her voice stayed calm, too calm. Listen to me, Margaret said. I don't need a palace, I need a home. Emily whispered, I'll come see you. Margaret held onto that promise like air. The next day, Emily visited alone. She looked smaller than Margaret remembered, not because she had changed, but because guilt makes people shrink. They hugged. Margaret felt her daughter's hands trembling. I hate this, Emily whispered. Margaret wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, but it was, not completely but enough, because love is proven at the moment it's inconvenient. Emily had barely sat down when her phone rang. Mark, Emily muttered, stepping outside. Margaret watched through the glass door. Emily's face tightened, her shoulders rising as if being pulled by invisible strings. A minute later, Emily returned. Mom, she said nervously, Mark wants to come inside for a minute. Margaret's chest tightened. Mark walked in like he owned the air. He didn't greet Margaret. He looked around at the room, the chair, the small closet, like inspecting a storage unit. So this is it, Mark said, half smiling. Not so bad. Margaret stared at him, calm but burning inside. Mark continued, Emily says you want to move in with us. Margaret replied carefully, I want to live with my family. Mark laughed lightly. Family. Right? Then his tone changed. You understand this isn't about emotions. This is about practicality. We have our life, our space, our future. Margaret's eyes sharpened. And I am what? She asked quietly. A problem, Mark shrugged. You're a responsibility? Emily flinched. Margaret felt a familiar rage, one she used to feel when men dismissed her at work. She held it down because she didn't want to lose Emily. Mark leaned forward. Look, Margaret. You did your part, you raised them, great. But now you have to accept reality. Senior homes exist for a reason. Margaret's voice became low and steady. Senior homes exist, she said, because children forget what their parents did for them. Mark's smile faded. You're making Emily feel guilty, he said sharply. That's manipulation. Emily whispered, Mark, please. Mark stood up. We're leaving? Emily didn't move. Mark grabbed her wrist, not hard, but enough. Margaret's eyes widened. Don't touch her like that, Margaret said, voice cutting through the room. Mark turned, irritated. Stay out of it. Margaret stood. Her knees ached, but her spine felt strong. You don't get to speak to my daughter like she's property, Margaret said. Mark stepped closer, anger rising. You're in no position to lecture anyone. Emily tried to pull away. Mark, stop. He tightened his grip. Margaret's hand moved without thinking. She slapped Mark's hand away. It wasn't violent, but it was loud. A sound like a door slamming. Mark's eyes widened in shock. You just hit me, he said, almost laughing. Margaret's chest rose and fell. I protected my children my whole life, she said. Don't test how much I can still protect. Mark's face hardened. This is exactly why you can't live with us, he snapped at Emily. She's unstable. Unstable. Margaret felt sick. Emily cried. She's not unstable, she's my mother. Mark pointed toward Margaret like she was a warning sign. If you bring her home, I'm done, he said. I mean it. Emily froze. A husband's ultimatum, a mother's silence, two worlds tearing her apart. Margaret stepped back slowly, and that's when she realized the darkest truth. Her children weren't just abandoning her. They were being controlled. And the people controlling them hated her. Because Margaret represented something dangerous, a mother who couldn't be silenced. After Mark stormed out, Emily collapsed into the chair, shaking. I'm sorry, she cried. I'm so sorry. Margaret sat beside her and held her hand. I don't want you to lose your marriage, Margaret whispered. Emily looked up, tears soaking her cheeks. But why does loving you cost me everything? She asked. Margaret's heart broke because she finally understood. It wasn't only the children, it was the partners, the poison, the whispers, the fear of inconvenience, the hunger for comfort. That night when Emily left, she hugged Margaret tightly. I'll fix this, she promised. Margaret nodded, but her eyes followed Emily down the hallway like a prayer leaving the body. Then the door closed, and Margaret was alone again. Later, her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Just one line, stop poisoning your children against their spouses or we'll make sure you never leave Maple Grove. Margaret's fingers went cold. She read it again and again. A threat, real, direct, ugly, her heart pounded. Because now this wasn't just abandonment. This was a plan, a coordinated plan, and somewhere outside that room, people were deciding her life like she was an object. Margaret stared at the ceiling, her husband's watch in her palm. She whispered to the darkness, I built 4 lives and now they're burying mine while I'm still breathing. But then something changed inside her. A quiet decision. If they wanted her silent, she would speak. If they wanted her weak, she would fight. Not with fists, with truth, with proof, with a mother's last strength. In the hallway outside, the night nurse walked past room 214, and Margaret Wilson, once powerful then abandoned, picked up her phone and began writing. Names, dates, messages, bank transfers, everything, because she finally understood old age isn't what destroys parents, it's betrayal, and betrayal leaves tracks. Margaret Wilson had spent her whole life signing documents. Contracts, budgets, approval forms. She never imagined that one day paper would be used against her. The threat message stayed on her phone all night. She didn't delete it. She didn't reply. She read it again and again until fear slowly turned into clarity. People don't threaten you unless they're afraid of something. And Margaret suddenly understood they were afraid of her memory. The next morning, she requested a meeting with the Maple Grove administrator. A polite woman named Mrs. Collins greeted her with a practiced smile. Is everything okay, Miss Wilson? She asked. Margaret placed her phone on the desk. Someone is trying to control my access to my own children, Margaret said calmly, and my finances. Mrs. Collins' smile faded. That's concerning, Margaret nodded. I want copies of every document signed on my behalf since I arrived. Mrs. Collins hesitated. Of course, she said slowly. But may I ask why? Margaret looked straight into her eyes. Because I didn't sign them? 2 hours later, Margaret sat in her room with a thick folder on her lap. Admission forms, care agreements, financial authorization papers. Her heart pounded as she flipped through the pages. Then she saw it. Her signature, or something that looked like it. Sloppy, forced, wrong. Margaret's hands began to shake. Someone had forged her signature. She called Emily immediately. Emily answered on the second ring. Mom, Emily, Margaret said quietly, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Emily sensed the change in her tone. I think your siblings and their partners have been moving my money, Margaret continued. And I think someone signed papers in my name without my permission. Silence. Then Emily whispered, "Oh my God." Emily came that evening, alone. She closed the door behind her and burst into tears. "I knew something was wrong," she cried. "Daniel told me not to worry about the finances. He said Laura was handling it." Margaret held her daughter's face. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "do you know what power of attorney means?" Emily nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered. "It means control." Margaret closed her eyes. "They gave themselves control over my life," she said. Meanwhile, across town, a different conversation was happening. Daniel sat in his living room with Laura. Michael and Rachel were on speakerphone. Laura's voice was sharp. "She's asking questions," Laura said. "She requested paperwork from Maple Grove." Michael cursed under his breath. "She shouldn't have access to that," Rachel snapped. "She's old." Confused, Daniel rubbed his face. "She's not confused," he said quietly. Laura turned toward him. "Don't get weak now," she warned. "We already moved the funds. If she pulls out, we're exposed." Exposed. That word settled heavily in the room. Back at Maple Grove, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She asked for help, not from her children, from a lawyer. A retired resident named Mr. Thomas Reed, who lived 2 doors down, listened carefully as Margaret explained. "This isn't neglect," he said finally. "This is exploitation." Margaret swallowed. "What do I do?" Mr. Reed leaned forward. "You document everything," he replied. "And you prepare for war." That same night, Daniel visited, alone. No Laura, no explanations, just guilt walking through a door. "Mom," he said awkwardly, "you look tired." Margaret smiled sadly. "I've been tired for years," she replied. "You just notice now." Daniel sat down. "Laura said you're misunderstanding things," he said. "She said the paperwork was necessary." Margaret slid the forged document across the table. "Did you sign this?" she asked. Daniel froze. I don't know," he stammered. Margaret leaned back. "Daniel," she said calmly, "I carried you for 9 months. I know when you're lying." Daniel's face collapsed. Laura had signed it. He didn't stop her, because convenience is louder than conscience. "Why?" Margaret asked softly. Daniel's eyes filled. "Because she said you'd drain us," he whispered. "She said you'd live forever and take everything." Margaret closed her eyes, a mother reduced to a financial risk. The argument escalated quickly. "You chose money over me," Margaret said, her voice trembling for the first time. Daniel stood up, frustrated. "You always guilt us," he shouted. "You think sacrificing makes you superior?" Margaret stood too. "I didn't sacrifice to control you," she said. "I sacrificed so you wouldn't suffer." Daniel slammed his fist on the table. "I'm tired of feeling like I owe you." The sound echoed through the room. Residents stared, nurses rushed over. Daniel looked around, embarrassed. Margaret felt something break inside her, not anger, acceptance. "Then don't owe me," she said quietly. "Just don't steal from me." Daniel froze. He left without another word. That night, Margaret couldn't breathe properly. Her chest tightened. Her vision blurred. A nurse rushed her to the emergency room. A panic attack, that's what the doctor called it. Margaret called it heartbreak. Emily sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand. "I'm with you," Emily said firmly. "No matter what happens." Margaret looked at her daughter. And for the first time in months, they believed someone, but the worst was yet to come. The next morning, Margaret received an official notice. Request for mental competency evaluation, filed by Daniel and Michael. Margaret stared at the paper. They were trying to declare her unfit. Legally, permanently, so she could never challenge them, so she could never leave, so she could never speak. Margaret folded the paper slowly. Her hands were steady now. Because fear had finally burned out, replaced by something stronger. Resolve. She looked at Emily and said the words that changed everything. "They don't want a mother anymore. They want an asset to disappear." Emily nodded through tears. "What do we do?" Margaret picked up her phone. She smiled faintly. "We fight," she said, "and this time we don't do it quietly." Outside the hospital window, traffic moved on. People laughed. Life continued. Unaware that a mother once powerful, then abandoned, was about to remind her children of one simple truth. You can forget your parents, but the law does not. The courtroom didn't look like justice. It looked cold, too clean, too quiet, like a place where emotions were expected to behave. Margaret Wilson sat straight in her chair, hands folded, wearing a simple gray coat. She looked calm to anyone watching from the outside. Inside, she was holding herself together with memory. Across the room sat her sons. Daniel avoided eye contact. Michael stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Behind them, like shadows that had learned how to speak, sat Laura and Rachel, partners, planners, witnesses for the other side. The judge adjusted his glasses. "We are here to determine the mental competency of Miss Margaret Wilson," he said evenly. Competency, a word that erased decades of work, intelligence, sacrifice. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly. Laura's lawyer spoke first. "Your Honor, Miss Wilson is elderly, emotionally unstable, and has shown signs of paranoia. She believes her children are conspiring against her." Margaret felt the sting. Paranoia, that was how truth was described when it made people uncomfortable. Then Rachel stood. "We only want what's best for her," she said, voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "She forgets things, she imagines threats, we're worried she'll hurt herself." Margaret wanted to laugh. They had never worried about her when she worked until midnight. Never worried when she collapsed alone in her bathroom. Concern only appeared when money did. Emily sat beside Margaret. She squeezed her mother's hand. "I'm here," she whispered. That was enough to keep Margaret breathing. Then it was Margaret's turn. She stood slowly. The courtroom watched her like she was an object on trial. "I've managed million-dollar budgets," Margaret began calmly. "I raised 4 children alone after my husband died. I ran a household, a career, and a future for my family." She paused. "And now I'm being told I'm incapable because I asked questions." Her lawyer placed documents on the table. Bank statements, forged signatures, threat messages. The judge leaned forward. Laura's face tightened. Michael shifted in his seat. Margaret continued, her voice steady. "I was placed in a senior facility without my consent. My finances were accessed without my permission, and when I asked for clarity, I was labeled unstable." She looked directly at her sons. "I didn't become weak because I aged, I became inconvenient." The room went silent. The judge asked Daniel to speak. Daniel stood reluctantly. "Your Honor," he said, swallowing hard, "I love my mother, but she's difficult. She causes tension in our marriages. We thought professional care would be better." Margaret felt something tear. Difficult? That was the word used for women who refused to disappear quietly. The judge nodded slowly. Then he turned to Margaret. "Miss Wilson, one final question," he said. "Do you feel safe with your family?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She thought of the threat message, the forged papers, the dinner table, the silence. "No," she said softly. "I don't." The decision was postponed, but the damage was done. Outside the courtroom, everything exploded. In the hallway, Laura grabbed Daniel's arm. "You embarrassed us," she hissed. "You let her speak too much." Daniel snapped back. "She showed proof, Laura. What was I supposed to do?" Michael joined in, angry. "This was your plan," he shouted at Rachel. "You said it was foolproof." Rachel crossed her arms. "Don't act innocent. You wanted the money." Voices rose. People stared. Emily stood frozen, watching her family fall apart in public. Then Laura said something she shouldn't have. "She should have died with her husband," Laura snapped. The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Emily's face went white. "What did you say?" Emily whispered. Laura turned cold. "I said she's ruining our lives." That was it. Years of silence broke. Emily stepped forward. "You married into this family," she said, voice shaking but loud. "You don't get to erase my mother." Laura laughed bitterly. "She's a burden." Emily's hand moved before thought caught up. A slap, sharp, echoing, the hallway froze. Laura screamed. Daniel shouted. Michael lunged forward. Security rushed in. Chaos. Margaret watched it all like a stranger. This was the price of silence. This was what happened when resentment grew unchecked. That night, Margaret collapsed again. This time, it wasn't panic. It was exhaustion. A nurse held her hand as she cried quietly. "I gave them everything," Margaret whispered. "And they still wanted more." Emily stayed with her all night. She didn't leave, didn't check her phone, didn't answer Mark's calls. For the first time, she chose her mother without hesitation. The next morning, the judge's decision arrived. Mental competency fully intact. Financial control returned to Miss Wilson immediately. Restraining notice issued against unauthorized access. Margaret read the words slowly. Relief didn't come. Clarity did. Daniel called, crying, "Mom, please," he begged. "This went too far." Margaret closed her eyes. "It went too far when you chose comfort over conscience," she replied. Michael texted apologies. Rachel disappeared. Laura blamed everyone. Margaret turned to Emily. "I'm done begging," she said quietly. Emily nodded. "So am I." They packed Margaret's belongings together, not to move back with her children, but to start something new, a small apartment. Simple, safe. As they left Maple Grove, Margaret looked back once, not with sadness, with resolve. She had lost her sons, but she had found her voice. And somewhere deep inside, she knew the final lesson hadn't been delivered yet, because consequences don't end in courtrooms. They end in hearts. The apartment was small, one bedroom, one couch, one quiet kitchen, but for Margaret Wilson it felt larger than the house she once owned. Because no one there wanted her to disappear, Emily helped unpack slowly, not rushing. Not distracted. Every folded sweater felt like an apology. Every cup placed in the cabinet felt like healing. Margaret watched her daughter move around the apartment and wondered how she had almost lost her too. Love doesn't vanish suddenly, it fades when it isn't defended. Daniel came first, 3 weeks later, unannounced. He stood outside the door holding flowers Margaret had once loved. She didn't invite him in immediately. That silence hurt him more than shouting ever could. "Mom," he said, voice cracking, "I messed up." Margaret studied his face. He looked older, smaller. "I didn't lose my mind, Daniel," she said calmly. "I lost my place in your life." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't think it would go this far," he whispered. Margaret replied quietly, "That's what everyone says when damage is already done." Michael came next, not with flowers. With excuses, he talked about pressure, about Rachel, about stress. Margaret listened, then asked one question: "If I had no money, would you still be here?" Michael couldn't answer. That was his answer. Sophia sent messages, long ones. Emotional ones, apologies mixed with explanations. Margaret replied politely, but distance remained, because forgiveness doesn't always mean access. Emily stayed every day. She cooked with her mother, watched old movies, listened, really listened. One night, Emily said something that made Margaret cry. "I didn't choose you when it mattered," she whispered. "But I'm choosing you now." Margaret held her hand. "Then that choice matters," she replied. Months passed. Life grew quieter. Health improved. Laughter returned in small pieces. Margaret started volunteering, helping other seniors navigate paperwork, rights, dignity. She became a voice for those who had been silenced. Ironically, old age had given her purpose again. Then the call came from the hospital. Michael had been in an accident. Serious. Daniel called right after, panic in his voice. "They're asking for family," he said. "Please come." Margaret closed her eyes. This was the moment, the final test. She went, not running, not angry, just present. Michael lay in bed, pale and scared. When he saw her, he cried. "I thought you'd never come," he whispered. Margaret stood beside him. "I didn't stop being your mother," she said softly. "You stopped being my son when it was inconvenient." Michael sobbed. Daniel watched from the corner, broken. That day, roles reversed. The children felt small. The mother felt strong. Michael recovered. Slowly. Pain teaches lessons comfort never could. Daniel divorced Laura months later. Rachel left too. Partners who built relationships on greed don't stay when resources disappear. One evening, all 4 children sat in Margaret's small apartment. No lawyers, no shouting, just truth. Margaret spoke last. "I won't live with any of you," she said gently. "Not because I hate you, but because I finally learned my worth." They cried, all of them, too late tears, but real. Margaret made her final decision. Her will was updated. Assets divided, not equally, but responsibly. A portion went to charity, a portion to senior rights organizations. Emily was given guardianship, not because she was perfect, but because she learned. On her 75th birthday, Margaret stood before a small group at a community center. She said something that silenced the room. "Parents don't need luxury in old age, they need presence." People cried, some left early to call their parents. Margaret returned home that night and sat by the window. She wasn't lonely. She was complete. She whispered to herself, "I gave birth to children, but I had to raise myself again." Final moral for the listener: children don't abandon parents suddenly. They do it slowly, with excuses, with comfort, with silence. And one day, they realize what they lost when it's too late to fix it. If your parents are alive, call them, visit them, bring them home, because old age homes are not built for parents. They are built for forgotten love.